Always.
It's like, hit it.
All right. What's up, y'all?
What's going on? What's going on?
All right.
Hey, y'all. Hey, all four of y'all. What's cracking?
See, unfortunately, it should have been just 3, so we could say all 3 of y'all.
Oh, tree of y'all. La, la, la. Is that Lil Nas? No, who is that in that picture of Black and Brew? Is that actually the person? Oops.
Yeah, that doesn't look familiar. So,
Oh, now there's 3. So find out what's up, all trio.
even.
Rao, sorry I showed up. We are not sorry you showed up, Rao. You are a hoot. A hooty hoot. Chittamasa. What's up? Hey, James.
Was I with you when the Manny Fresh thing just got stuck in my head? I can't remember what somebody said something. It was just stuck in my head.
That'd be the worst.
The tattoos, Wardy Manny Fresh.
Hey, Ricky Ryan.
What's going on?
There's this song, Ricky Raccoon. Ricky Raccoon.
Is that like a kid song?
Huh?
Is that a
It's
kid
a kid.
song?
Yeah, it's a kid song.
Yeah. I have definitely not heard that.
I think it was on Barney and Friends. Like all of these songs are flooding back to me now that I have a toddler, and there's various things that there's this generation's versions of those things. She don't watch a lot of anything, but the songs seem to be the same, just remixed.
I mean, the whole point of most of that stuff at that age is to just expose to basic things. So how different could they be?
Mm-hmm. I spent too much on skincare for a Ricky Raccoon reference. True. And you're not a coon. See, that could go either way, like eye bags or if he was a coon, but you're neither. So
but I'll allow it for Sankara only.
Thank you, Leah. She is feeling 1,000 times better, but she has 2 more. She has like 6 teeth coming in right now. She has like 4 molars and then the 2. Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, that one, because I wasn't tripping when I said I saw one back like on the bottom. Yeah.
Yeah, she got 2 on the top, 2 molars on the top, 2 molars on the bottom, and then 2 more that I just saw the other day. So
and getting big, and
she is. Oh my god. Yeah, no, Gracie's Corner is a bop, but you know what? We are concerned about the level of color and motion there, because some things. So yeah. And there's, I feel some of the newer stuff, we actually have been watching some Reading Rainbow, because I feel like the newer stuff, I'm not gonna lie, the stuff on YouTube, I do think that there could be stuff in there to try to get that ignites to like addiction. You know what I mean? Like the same type of elements are in social media, I think might be in this newer age stuff. I don't know. So she don't watch. So we try to not do too much.
No, I've seen like some like educational psychologists and talk about educational psychologists talk about exactly that. Like they're like some of the older cartoons, like there's color, but there's like a staticness to them. And like because I think somebody was saying in particular, like Coco Melon is actually terrible.
Yeah.
because of how
stimulating.
Yeah.
So, but with Gracie's Corner, we'll listen to it. So my daughter, she likes to carry it. We have this portable speaker. She loves to carry around the speaker. So we'll like put on some of the songs. But also we've been putting on a lot of Jackson 5. And even watching some of the videos, because it's like, they just stepping, spinning, doing a little, So
well, she been getting a good dose of classic music since she was in the womb. So
I've seen 0 episodes of Coco Melon. I know nothing about it. I know that it is a children's show. That's it.
So when I was babysitting a friend of mine's child, he likes Wheels on the Bus, and I had played the Gracie's Corner Wheels on the Bus version, and he was like, this kind of he was like 1.5 at the time. He was like, this kind of what I want, but it ain't really what I want. And then his dad told me that it was, I think they play it at his daycare, like it was the Coco Melon version, and he was like, yes, that's the one that I want.
It's like, that's the vibe. Yeah. So, these are part of the questions about, I used to really like, so Wendy Muse, she had the Left Pocket podcast, but she had like a Revolutionary Mommy or something. I don't know if it was a separate podcast or a series that she would do. And I used to really like listening to her. This was now I have even more appreciation for it as like a mom. But she had her baby Harriet like in the pandemic, like literally March 2020, which is so crazy. So yeah, anyway, these are the things we got to think about. Let's see. Zio's going to try to get their messaging into cartoons since they clearly lost all the way down to Gen Alpha. Well, Miss Rachel did a little something for Palestine, so she's safe for now. I see that linen, Dr. CBS. Yeah, there's this linen, that linen. There's a lot of linen. Those are just the ones I randomly turned around. Yeah, man. Left Pocket Pockets, how I found CBS in 2018. Shout out to you, Ricky. Still remains one of my favorite episodes.
In 2018, damn.
Preach. Yeah, that was back in the day.
That's in the day.
Yes, I think the first podcast I was on, Olufemi Tawo invited me on some podcast. Hey, Keontae. Anyway, we just we have bullshitted too much because we got.
Well, we don't have this. This is life. This is the life section.
Yes. The only life update I have is that we are officially puzzlers. And I have to say, this might be the worst thing that's ever happened to Sankara in her young life, because we really be puzzling, and we gotta defend the puzzle because she's quick too. She's grabbed a handful of puzzles and or pieces and thrown them. But nah, we're puzzlers now. We puzzling. That's my only life update.
That is something y'all should bring the young brothers y'all met in Indianapolis. That is something that we talked about doing. That is something we might pursue going forward. I don't have no major life updates myself. Although, like, for a while, Sharice and Dartrisha have both been telling me that Gucci Mane's autobiography is really good, and I'm in this like book club with some friends. Elsewhere, don't you have a physical copy of it? I'm listening to it. I'm listening to it on audiobook. And so I've started listening to it, and I'm not really like, rap is not like, I am definitely an R&B girl. Like, I know the lyrics, the everything to most R&B songs, but hip hop is not really my genre. But I do find the autobiography extremely interesting and engaging, and I am enjoying it. I'm about like halfway through now.
Wait till you get to the part about Brick Squad. Have you got to the part about, doesn't it sound like a quasi commune socialist where like they're talking about how like everybody would just be in, not Brick Squad, the Brick House with like the recording studio, like everybody would be there, like it was real collective. Wait till you get to that part, because
okay, I don't think I was there.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm not saying they socialists. I'm just saying they.
Wait, what does that say? As long as the Coochie Man doesn't write his auto, what?
I don't know who that is.
I don't either. And the other book that I'm reading, I think I mentioned to you all my considerations about like death dueling, and this woman, Aloha Arthur, who has this company going with Grace. She has a book that's called Briefly Perfectly Human. And so I listened to that recently, it's part memoir, but the memoir stories are like about how she comes to death dueling. And so it's like her experiences with death over the course of her life, and like how she, like, I think like her first death doula experience was her brother-in-law, and so like the process of trying to help her sister through the death of her brother-in-law is like kind of what pushed her down the path into death doula work. She was like a legal aid attorney or something before that, and so it's been really interesting to listen to her, one, talk about like the types of considerations that one has to make in terms of like trying to make end of life transitions, both for the person that's dying and for the people who are losing someone, but also just her general thoughts about like life and death, and like making peace with some of our experiences, I think, on earth, and what it means to literally like go with grace and trying to like create situations where people get to die with dignity, even, when they, don't necessarily have a lot of resources, all kinds of things, when you don't know what to do, like just all of the mundane things, like there's like the very human things about like, oh, I want to look and feel a certain way as I die. And then there's all the like administrative shit about like, how do you deal with ending a person's life? As as the living that go on without them afterwards. So that has been really thought provoking, and I think right now I need to pursue this past to tenure to figure out what that's gonna happen. But I do think that like something about the death doula work is like really calling to me, and I just need to figure out what that might look like in the future. So that's one of my, I don't, this is the thing. Rad said, I'll skip that book. It's morbid. I don't like and this is another thing that she talks about. Like, she's like, a lot of people have like these taboos about death and they don't want to talk about death. But the thing is, death is the one thing that we absolutely all will do. We will all die point in time. And like being able, I mean, I don't know. I have dealt with a lot of death over the course of my life, close to me and beyond. And I feel like, sometimes having a lot of these like superstitions or taboos or fears about talking about death really makes it so much more difficult, I think, to deal with. And so I think like being able, and even like this end of life things, like if you have folks in your family and you want to have conversations about what to do with end of life, but people are afraid to even talk about them, then you leave your family like arguing and bickering over things that would have been so much easier if there had been open conversations about what you want to happen, as you pass. Like my dad's sister planned her funeral down to the T, to the type of food that was going to be served, to what she wanted people to wear. And I think it made it really easy for her daughters to execute. And I think that was her purpose. Her purpose wasn't because she was the type of person that wanted to control everything. She didn't want it to be something that was emotionally burdensome and administratively burdensome in the process of losing her for her daughters. So I don't know. I think those are really, really important. I think Keontae also asked how my plants are doing. My plants are actually doing quite well. So I'm feeling good about them.
Well, as I said before, just roll me up in a fucking carpet and throw me in a Wendy's dumpster. This shit is too expensive. Price is way too high. They need to cut it. And then I said,
I'm sorry, I said Deontay. I meant Keontae. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, no, I don't know. Like, I don't know.
Layla, that part, I mean, not Layla, Erica, that part was not in the autobiography. So I don't know if I believe you.
What you talking?
She said Gucci Mane kicked the girl out of a moving car on the highway.
Oh my God.
That is not funny. It was not in the book. And also,
Ricky said I like the control aspect. I don't know. I mean, I think it also matters if you gotta know your family. Like,
yes, Ashley Knuckles, we did see your email, and we're going to get to it at the end of the show because we didn't want to shove it in there before we start our conversation. Yes. But yes, we saw it. We're gonna let us know if you want us to read it on air or just respond. I think we should read it if you don't mind, because there's some good stuff in there. Okay, good. Yes, but we definitely are going to talk about that. Don't tread chocolate chip.
Let's see. You said, I guess there's a season for preparation transition. The problem is we know not the time nor the hour. So we always putting off when we prepare for death, not knowing when it's going to happen. It could be a random accident. it could be something that you know is coming, but we don't know. And my mom died suddenly. We had no idea she had a sudden heart attack. Other people are sick and ill. Fortunately, like, we weren't the type of family that was bickering over dumb shit, so it was relatively,
Yeah.
apart from the loss, it was relatively easy to deal with the administrative stuff. But it's still hard. Like, I just want to grieve the person that I lost, and now I got to close out bank accounts and figure out where stuff is, and close out accounts to pay bills and all this other stuff. Like, that's a lot, and that's a part of the work that death doulas do.
Yeah, I think that that's really important, and it's actually really helpful because, like, you never know what state you're going to be. I mean, you're going to be grieving, but how that grief manifests, as you're saying, you could completely shut down. Some people get hyper like focused and can, you know what I mean, just to avoid. So there's all kinds of things. So I think just like, when you bring life into the world, like it's good to have somebody who knows logistical things. I can definitely see how having, somebody support you while when you have somebody leave the world, how that can be very.
There was one story in the book where this woman, her father died, and she thought she was going to be responsible for her father's death. Literally on his deathbed, her father tells her that she got 5 other siblings by a whole bunch of different women, and he wants them to all coordinate on his death. And like, so the work of the death doula in this instance ended up being, a lot of them had never met each other. And so a lot of the work that she ended up doing was just being like, okay, these are all of the essential tasks. How do you all come together to figure out what strengths do each of you all have? And how can each of you all feel like you are a part of this process of helping your father transition to death, and and work on you all's relationship with each other? And like, she said initially she felt very incapable of doing that because she felt like that was something that a counselor should do. But she ended up doing it. You learn a lot about, people, just human behavior. So like, I don't know. That's why I said it's a memoir, but it's not it is partially about her life, but she tells all these stories about the different types of death situations that she's had to navigate. And I think it's actually really useful to think about.
I would be so almost to the point, like, you need at least 48 hours notice for this type of request. Sorry about that, but I would be.
I agree, Leah. I do feel like that was very selfish of their father to do to them at the last moment.
It's the coordination piece. It's not even so there's the initial shock of, wow, what was my life? But then there's also like, I have to coordinate with strangers who also have skin in the game because this is their dad too.
Mind you, her parents were married her whole life. So all these kids was born when her mom and dad were married. So she's also finding out that her dad was a philandering
was a Rolling Stone. Wait, that was his home. Ooh, that's rough. I'm kind of we went on Brian.
I was getting ready to say, yeah, because we have a packed show today, y'all. Which is also why we're not going to read the comments from last show now. We might address a few of them towards the end of the show, depending on how timing goes. But we do have Brian Kwoba on today to talk about his new book on Hubert Harrison, and then Ajamu Baraka to talk about, the intensification of war and the particularities of Israel and Iran and why that should be of importance to us as African people. Child, a funeral, baby mama, I ain't got no time. It's just, oof. I always believe my granddad had German kids. I'm just waiting. Hey, you gotta trust your instincts. I can't be getting surprised with 5 siblings, but how would you know? We don't know what these people be up to when we're not in the vicinity.
Oh, by the way, Huey, Teray, and Kruma, if you're here, we saw your question, and we actually do have a question along those lines, and we'll try to loop in. In fact, let me start these. We'll loop in your question about Hubert Harrison.
3 women showed up pregnant to the funeral. Good. I also think maybe it's the anthropologist in me too that is interested in like death rituals and like just social behavior around death. I think it's really interesting. And I also think, last week we were talking about, Sharice, how you appreciate people who are easy to laugh. And I was having a conversation with somebody else about like comedians and how comedians find like humor in everything. And like, a lot of people feel like death is morbid and, and all these other kinds of things. The thing that comedians will do is immediately find stupid shit to laugh about when people die. And that's also something I think about. I think about in the worst times and in all the crazy funeral situations I've been into. I remember the moments that were hilarious at funerals, in the immediate aftermath of losing people and
everything. Some death and birth rituals tell entire stories of a culture.
Yes, they do.
Yep. What does it say about our culture that most people can't afford a proper burial? That we have something called a fucking pauper's grave because people.
I also think that's why a lot of people are turning to cremation, despite whatever their kind of moralistic, religious beliefs might be about what to do with bodies after death. It's just a much more financially expedient option in death than $10,000 caskets.
Yeah, that's wild, man. I don't even know what to say. Oof, 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 oof.
Did you hear from them?
No, I sent Brian a message. Y'all, this is a first in the history of LSR.
I know.
But we're waiting on our guest. Put me in the jar is going to be in the will. Yeah, literally.
My mom is cremated, and I've actually found more peace in cremation. Also, the other thing I think about cremation too is that when people were staying in places where they were from and actually had homesteads, I think burials made sense because they were collective sites around which people gathered. But when families don't have homesteads anymore, or like a place that's home, like my grandparents, lived in Fayetteville and my parents were raised in Fayetteville, but nobody lives there anymore. And so like, how often do people actually go back to physically visit those grave sites where like me, I have my mother's ashes with me and I've been doing a process of putting bits of her ashes in places where I travel. And that feels more significant. Turn my mom into a tree. I actually like that idea.
Yeah, that's the thing. So like when my grandma passed away 2 years ago now, December 2023. She was in Arizona with my mom. Her funeral was in Tennessee, but then she wanted to be buried in Nebraska because that's where we have her. That's where my mom was, that's where they're from effectively. Family's from Tennessee, but she raised her children in Nebraska basically. And so, yeah, so that much more itinerant lifestyle that we have. And that's like, that ain't cheap. And it's like logistically, and like you're saying, like, so thinking about a death doula, when you got all going through all that, it's good to have somebody.
Yeah. I mean, I think about as many funerals as my family had already had, even still for us with all the people that we had to draw on, it still felt overwhelming, like everything that had to be done in such a short period of time when my mom died. And like, if there had been somebody who was not necessarily emotionally tethered to the process to help guide through I just felt like that would have been so much, it would have taken a lot of pressure off, I feel like.
Yeah.
Omaha,
Lincoln, Nebraska, rad. Yeah, I have my dad's ashes on my desk.
I mean, people feel strongly about the whole burial versus like my grandfather was very much a church going man. And when we made the decision, which was my mother's decision to cremate my mother, he was very upset about our decision to cremate my mom. Cause if it is that you believe that there needs to be a body, on Judgment Day to be taken back, and we done ground that thing up into ashes. We have essentially, banished her to eternal damnation in his theological eyes. So I can understand, the upset based on those beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So still no word.
Still no word. I'm like, can I call? Surely I have his number. Maybe. Oh, wait, no.
I mean, yeah, you're right. It's bones. It's not a body, but again, that all has to do with things about what you believe. Throw dust in guys' eyes.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, we still had a funeral. We still had a open casket funeral for my mother, and that was really more for the people who believed in those things in our family. It wasn't really like my nuclear family didn't care about that as much. Extended family did. God doesn't know how to recreate bodies. Did he lose that talent after Adam and Eve? Oh, there's Brian.
Okay. African ass Brian. Wait, just kidding.
Brian. It's actually the time zone. I thought we were Central Time and East. Y'all are Eastern Time, I guess. So my bad. Sorry.
And then Brian, I just knew you was gonna be in some fly print. And I'm just like, what is happening?
I'm sorry. I'm like, yeah, I just totally messed up with the time zones. But I'm here. Hey, I'm here.
It happens.
How are y'all doing?
Way past CPT. That's straight up decolonial time.
No, so, we were just actually having an extended conversation about death and death doing. So,
yeah. Wow. Okay.
Nice and upbeat conversation.
I don't find it morbid or depressing, but apparently some people do. Yeah, I've recently read this book by this woman, Alua author, called Briefly Perfectly Human, who's a death doula. And so we were just talking about end of life things.
Okay. Yeah, sounds heavy.
All right. Well, let's get started. We got a lot of ground. Yeah, got a lot of ground to cover. So.
All right. So I'm gonna just read your biography briefly, and then we'll get into it. So Dr. Brian Kwoba is an associate professor of history and director of the African and African American Studies program at the University of Memphis. His research focuses on social movements and the politics of race, class, and gender in the African diaspora. While completing his doctoral degree at the University of Oxford, he co-founded the Oxford Pan-African Forum and the Rhodes Must Fall movement to decolonize education at Oxford. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Kwoba has been an activist on issues including anti-imperialism, immigrant workers' rights, climate justice, Palestine, and the movement for Black lives. His new book, Hubert Harrison, Forbidden Genius of Black Radicalism, is an intellectual biography of one of history's most underappreciated political visionaries. So, thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. The book is here. Oh my gosh, can you believe it?
Yes. All right. So let's start with just a question about Hubert Harrison. So who was he? Can you just give us a sense of who he was? And then also, Jeff Perry wrote a massive 2-part biography of Hubert Harrison and also did an edited volume of a sampling of his writings. So what is your book's relationship to those Perry volumes? And then what is your unique contribution to excavating Harrison's life?
Great questions. Well, first off, I want to say thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I've been a fan of the podcast for a long time, and as you know, I've been wanting to get on the podcast. So I'm excited that this occasion allows us the opportunity for that. In September of 1912, almost a century before the Occupy Wall Street movement, there was a Black orator occupying the attention of a huge crowd of people in front of the New York Stock Exchange. And the booming baritone of this Black orator was growing husky as time grew on. He spoke for about 3 hours on the subject of socialism. And of course, I'm speaking of Hubert Harrison, who was, a lot of interesting things, including a pioneering Black socialist who, was really denouncing the billionaire oligarchs of his day, what we call the robber barons of the Gilded Age, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and so on. And Harrison was not only a pioneering Black socialist, but also one of the most prominent Black freethinkers of his day. He was very critical of the church and of religion, organized religion more generally. He was a Black free lover. He had a whole argument about how we're not monogamists by nature, and I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit. He was a radical internationalist, and Harrison was also a key catalyzer of the rise of Garvey and the Garvey movement. So yeah, fascinating figure, but he's been unfortunately written out of history because of his radicalism and because he was quite critical of a lot of institutions and organizations of his day. And so that's why not so many people know about him. But thanks to Perry, as you mentioned, Jeff Perry, may he rest in peace and power. He did an extraordinary thing, publishing, this massive 2-volume biography, putting in decades of research on Harrison. And I have to say, in any discussion of Perry, I'm definitely building on his work and on the extraordinary foundation that he laid. That said, at 1,200 pages between the 2 volumes, not including footnotes, it's a little daunting for the general reader. And I think what my book does, among other things, is it offers a single volume, sort of all-in-one interpretation of Harrison. Another thing that's a little different from my work and Perry is that I'm approaching Harrison from a unapologetically Black and African angle of vision on Harrison. So this leads me to interpret certain things about Harrison's life a little bit differently from Perry. For example, I'm very interested in Garvey and Garveyism, and I think it's one of the most sort of influential forces on a whole generation of African and Black nationalists, which I think Perry doesn't really reckon with as much. Perry is more interested in Harrison's socialist politics, which is important and, a necessary part of the puzzle, but it's not the whole story. Another example, or even better example, of a place where I'm different from Perry is I go into areas of Harrison's life that Perry and nobody else has actually even explored. And a perfect example of that is Harrison's free love politics, which, again, we'll probably get into a little bit later in the interview, but I think it's one of the most potent and generative dimensions of Harrison's political legacy, his sexuality and his sexual politics. But it's something no one has really addressed or systematically explored until now.
I think all of that is, really important context. I know that you talk about this book as an intellectual biography, and really you kind of talk about contextualizing his life, but you do take a little bit of space in the preface to talk about yourself in relationship to the work. And so something that I was interested in is you talk about some of the ways that your life and Harrison's life kind of parallel one another. And you talk about obviously Harrison's experience of having lost his job as a postal worker. You talk about your own experience of having lost your job as a teacher because of your politics. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about maybe perhaps that connection and maybe how Harrison in particular coped with losing his job and the impact that had on his sort of political development, and perhaps also what that did for your own political development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I did something maybe a little bit unusual for scholars in terms of telling a lot about my story and sort of my activism in the preface, but I thought that was important so that people would understand where I'm coming from and why it is that I interpret Harrison in the ways that I do. I do feel like we have a lot of similar life experiences, and that really positions me to understand the things that Harrison might have thought or felt as he was going through things like losing his job. So for those who don't know or who haven't read the book, Harrison is a great case study for what Du Bois, described as the Tuskegee machine. That is the apparatus of political repression that Booker T. Washington used to get Harrison fired from his job as a postal worker after Harrison wrote some op-ed pieces that were critical of Booker T. Washington's accommodationism. Washington was able to, exert a lot of political pressure on Black political figures around the turn of the century. And Harrison essentially fell victim to that and was kind of retaliated against by Washington's Tuskegee machine, which was an attempt to silence and discipline Harrison, but actually had the opposite effect, right? It actually, I think, radicalized him because he saw how little space there was for Black political dissent from Washington's accommodationist line at that particular time. And he ends up subsequently becoming a full-time organizer in the Socialist Party of America. So it actually gave him more time to organize, right? It set him up to take on a whole new phase of life where he becomes a full-time organizer for the socialists. I think it was also a lesson in the limits of the two-party system, particularly the Republican Party, which commanded the allegiance of Northern Black communities since the time of Lincoln, right? But by the 20th century had long since sold them out in the eyes of Harrison. And this was something Harrison educated people about, studied Lincoln carefully, tried to analyze, sort of why Black folks were so wedded to the Republican Party all these decades after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. And Harrison concluded, just as an aside, that from his own study of Lincoln and the Civil War, that the nation did not save the Negro, rather the Negro saved the nation. And so I see some parallels with that case in my own, in the sense that I too was fired from a job for my politics. I was teaching high school, for those who don't know the story. In my case, it was my anti-war and activist and sort of pro-Palestinian politics that got me fired. And I think the lesson that I took from Harrison's case is that basically defeat clarifies the mind, right? And it's okay to become more radical in the face of hard truths, like the ones I learned about the boundaries of acceptable thought and activity in the liberal school system that I was teaching in the People's Republic of Cambridge, Massachusetts. I learned, the hard way that there was a line in the sand and it was basically like this far and no further. But there were other lessons that I didn't take away from Harrison's experience because I in reflecting on this, I realized I also got a kind of post-firing whiplash or kind of traumatic injury where I actually felt reluctant to speak publicly about political issues for many years out of fear that I would lose my job again. And I wish I'd been able to take more of a lead from Harrison's fearlessness right after his firing, where he just jumps into the Socialist Party and, is doing his thing there. But I guess we all have our own paths in life. I'm happy to be now in a position where I feel more comfortable speaking publicly, having tenure, having this book out. It's in many ways a sort of coming out party or coming out moment for me because I've been relatively quiet and reserved ever since that moment of my firing, or at least especially the past few years being on the tenure track. Higher ed is so uncertain right now that I don't blame people who without tenure who don't feel comfortable speaking out, because that was me just a year or two ago.
Then you got the fucking nutcases like me. I don't give a fuck. I say anytime, and people can kiss my. I'm just kidding. Well, not really, but okay. So, in keeping with this line about Harrison, so you have a chapter about Harrison being a free thinker. So somebody who was critical of Christianity and other organized religions. But you also talk about Harrison's race-conscious free thinking. And so I wonder if you could talk a bit about the difference between Harrison's sort of acknowledgement of race in the context of free thinking or agnosticism, and how that might have differed from mainstream agnostic or atheist thought. And then also, what was Harrison's perception of the Black church, given it's one of the central counter publics in the Black community, to use like the terminology of Michael Dawson. So it's a place, you know, as Black people are cast out of mainstream politics, the church is like a key site of where politics and gathering and social formation happens.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah, I mean, Harrison, so I talk about this in chapter 3 of the book, about there's a sort of subsection where I go into Harrison as a free thinker. For those who don't know the background to this, you know, free thinkers basically looked upon Christianity and religion more generally with great skepticism and disdain as tools of oppression that served the rich and powerful. And so free thought publications like The Truth Seeker, for example, which Harrison wrote articles for, were very clear that they were seeking an end to prayers in school, the taxation of church properties, removing Bible oaths from the courtroom, removing chaplains from the army, basically a complete separation of church and state in all spheres. And Harrison saw the church as in league, like many white freethinkers or European freethinkers. Harrison saw the church as being in league with the capitalist class in their effort to dupe and exploit the workers of the world, justifying exploitation here on the grounds that, oh, there will be a better life in heaven, and so on. But Harrison was an agnostic, and he defined that very sort of specifically as refusing to believe anything that can't be sort of demonstrated to be true. And a Kenyan friend of mine actually made a really interesting point. I was in Kenya last month, and a friend of mine made this interesting point that agnostics are the real free thinkers because they're neither dogmatically religious nor dogmatically God deniers, right? They're literally in this space where, okay, if you can show me that it's true, if you can show some evidence that X, Y, and Z actually is the case, I'll go with it. But if not, I'm not going to believe it. And so I think that sort of fluidity and flexibility and just commitment to reason and sort of rational and evidence-based sort of scientific explanations is at the core of what a lot of free thinkers felt. They would just follow the path wherever reason would take them. Now, Harrison, as a race-conscious free thinker, you know, there's another layer here. Basically, he didn't want to worship a Jim Crow Jesus, to be blunt about it. He really denounced the way that he felt the church still enslaved the minds of Black people, much like slavery had done to their bodies. And he saw the church as not only helping to grease the wheels of slavery during the time that you know, Europeans imposed Christian sort of religion on the people they enslaved, but also that it was continuing even after slavery, that the church was continuing to keep Black people subservient, servile, and content. And so I think part of his effort to promote free thinking and to, you know, encourage people to question the church and question religion is that he saw religions as reactionary medieval hangovers that held back intellectual and material possibilities for liberation, and that Black people in particular had suffered from what he called the dubious blessings of Christianity, right? That of all the people in the world who you might expect would be in the free thinking fold, Black people were actually sort of conspicuous by their absence in a general sense, apart from a few exceptions like Harrison. And so, yeah, he really laid a foundation, I think, for other people, right, for a whole generation in some ways, of other free thinkers who would come forth. Some in the quote unquote Harlem Renaissance, but basically to pick up this idea and really run with it and start questioning the church, questioning what Christianity has done or justified in terms of anti-Black racial oppression and so many other things. And I think it's a key part of it's an element in the larger mix of his many radicalisms.
So if anybody else is interested in Black free thinkers, do you know the name of Chris Cameron's book? I'm sure you cited.
Yeah, I think it's called Black Free Thinkers. Yeah, so Chris Cameron has a book called Black Free Thinkers, if I'm not mistaken, which is a history of the sort of free thinking tradition in Black communities. He doesn't devote a lot of attention to Harrison. so I think my book certainly builds on his overview. But yeah, I cite him, and I'm going to be on a podcast this weekend with Black non-believers, which is sort of a modern day. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I actually really appreciate the characterization of agnosticism in that way. It's something that, even with my own agnosticism, I'm always like, I don't know, how do I really feel about this? So that characterization, I appreciate is useful. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it struck me too, because we think of atheists, for example, hardcore atheists as free thinkers. Free thinkers is a broad category, right? There's agnostics, there's atheists, there's other, but atheists can sometimes be very dogmatic, right? And it's like bending the stick too far sometimes, maybe in the other direction. So yeah, they're free thinkers, but in some ways, agnostics are even more free because they're not dogmatically taking the opposite side of the God-fearing folks, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's useful. So you've alluded to a few times Harrison's sort of free love politics, and so I want to kind of go a little bit deeper into chapter 6, which is Black free love politics of the queer new Negro, and that was a chapter that really piqued my interest. I was like, as I was reading, I was like, oh, I really want to read this chapter, closely. So I wanted to invite you to talk more about. I think, what do you call it? You call it intellectual non-monogamy, maybe? Is that what you call it?
Yep.
Yeah. I wanted you to talk more about Harrison's willingness to read and think widely across political spectrums, and what relationship, if any, you see that having to his sort of understanding of kind of free love politics and his early progressive ideas about free love and free thinking. Mm-hmm. Or more broadly, do you see a correlation between rejecting moralistic theological teachings and the development of a particular kind of Black radical politics?
So, Brian, hold that thought. I'm going to ask you a related question about sexuality, and then you can answer them both. So this comes from somebody named Huey Saray and Kruma in the chat. And they said, from my understanding, Hubert Harrison was into sexual freedom. Since monogamy is a Euro construct, I think, will it be necessary to end monogamy to end patriarchy and white supremacy? And then he said, correction, since monogamy is a Euro construction and a product of feudalism, therefore KK capitalism. Capitalism with a KK capitalism. Anyway. So you can answer those two separately, but I felt like they together.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, definitely I definitely see a correlation between Harrison's rejecting sort of moralistic theologies and his radicalism. And I should say also, I forgot to respond to Sharice's question earlier about the Black church. And he, as critical as Harrison was of the church, he also, especially a little bit later in life, he sort of warmed up to, at least to the idea of working with people who were, churchgoers and so on, because he understood that to have unity in the Black community, you have to reach where the majority is, which is the majority being, in or of the church. And so he kind of shifted over time about that, but we can come back and talk more about that later. But yeah, I mean, Harrison's anti-religious free thinking certainly positioned him to reject Christian pronouncements about a lot of things, not just the church's role in perpetuating capitalism and white supremacy and colonialism as a civilizing mission, for example, but also their puritanical or sex-negative moral code. In fact, free lovers like Harrison almost had to be free thinkers in this regard because of all the sort of sex-negative injunctions of the church. They also had to oftentimes be free speechers, given that the Comstock laws had criminalized all manner of sex-related speech and art and publications. And so, to sort of think about it in a modern frame, right? Nowadays, we don't speak so much about free love, but we might speak about polyamory, we might speak about ethical non-monogamy, open relationships, and so on. And I'm happy that in that chapter, I was able to sort of paint a picture of the wider world of Harlem in the 1920s during the so-called Renaissance, where, there were a lot of sort of sexualities and new kind of experimentations with erotic energy exchange taking place. And as Layla, as you alluded to, in the book, there's a moment where I describe Harrison's insatiable appetite for learning from a wide different range of fields as a kind of intellectual non-monogamy, right? He's intellectually not committed to just one particular framework or one particular discipline, or one particular sort of political ideology. He loves many simultaneously, right? And he's drawing from a whole range of different things. He would speak about geopolitics, right, to people on street corners. He would speak about ancient African history, labor economics, literary criticism, comparative theology, all kinds of different things. And of course, I'm riffing on the sexual non-monogamy of Harrison as a free lover when I describe him that way. But here's the bottom line. And I think the thing that really is special about that chapter, I mean, that was a very hard chapter to write. I went through many iterations, but I think it's in fact possibly one of the most generative and sort of innovative chapters in the whole book, because basically I uncover how Harrison is, as far as I can tell, the first figure in African-American history to denounce church and state repression of sexuality, and to offer a public-facing course in sex education, and to agitate for decriminalizing access to contraception, and to defend a love style based on variety and freedom, on the grounds that we are not monogamists by nature, but by the compulsion of the church and the state and capital. And so I do think that Jennifer Nash asks a very important question when she says, can we imagine Black political freedom without Black sexual freedom? Which gets to the question that was in the chat that you shared just a moment ago. Do we have, in other words, do we have to end monogamy, or what does a revolutionary politics have to say or have to do as it relates to monogamy? And here's where I would distinguish between monogamy, just plain and simple, and compulsory monogamy, which I define in the book as, right, this idea that the only respectable and legal and culturally legitimate way to relate romantically and sexually is with a maximum of one partner at a time. There's a compulsion to be monogamous, right? Monogamy is not the problem. Monogamy itself is just one particular format for two people agreeing to relate to each other exclusively. It's the making of that compulsory for everybody. That's where I think the problem comes in, because not everybody necessarily wants to or feels comfortable relating in that way. And so monogamy is fine. It's compulsory monogamy, right? Making this one particular format the requirement of everybody, that I think really does actually stifle and hold back our potential in so many ways. I mean, Audre Lorde speaks about the suppression of the erotic as part and parcel of a larger system of oppression that has to deprive oppressed people of any resource they can use that is life-giving, that is energy-giving, right? Including erotic energy. And so I think that just as we talk about, oppression in many different forms, I think one of the forms that we've not actually devoted enough thinking and theory and, attention towards is compulsory monogamy, and how it actually works to hold us back and limit us and create all kinds of drama and heartbreak and trauma in our relationships in some of the most sensitive and personal areas of our lives. So that's what I'm trying to do in this chapter, is to really open a conversation about what would it mean for us to actually incorporate an analysis of compulsory monogamy, or an interrogation of that, into a larger kind of revolutionary project that's criticizing capitalism and imperialism and white supremacy and all the rest of these things, because compulsory monogamy is actually part and parcel of that package, right? It's something that gets imposed on the world through European colonialism and white world domination in places where that never was the norm before, right? Most indigenous cultures in the world did not actually make monogamy the center of the universe when it comes to matters of sex and love and marriage. It is very much a capitalist, white Western colonial construction and puritanical Christian sort of, thing that I think needs to be challenged, and we need to not to say that everybody has to or should be non-monogamous, but just that we should decenter it. We shouldn't make it compulsory. We shouldn't make anything compulsory, right? That's the argument I ultimately make in the book, is that no particular relationship or romantic or sexual configuration should be compulsory, because human beings are just way too diverse, way too vast and interesting and complicated for a one-size-fits-all type of romantic love style.
I think that point was really driven home when you brought in the pieces from the Russian Revolution about the sexual revolution in Russia and the types of laws that they were trying to pass at the time to move away from that. I wonder if you could answer this kind of briefly, because I know we have a lot more questions, but Musa's comment, curious about Hubert Harrison's thoughts on queerness, sexuality, as many free love and non-monogamy folks can still perpetuate forms of homophobia. And there's something else in the chapter that's connected to that, because you talk about Harrison's own sort of openness to what we see as a lot of like gay homosexuality. But then there is this weird passage from his diary where he's kind of complaining about lesbianism. And you make a reading, you're like, oh, this could be one that perhaps he was making this comment because maybe he wanted more women to dance with him, or it could be read as another strain of homophobia, particularly against lesbian women. So I wonder, like in conversation with that, if you can answer Musa's question as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think that once we, and this is an interesting thing about the critique of monogamy, right? Is that something I just noticed along the way as I was trying to research the background for that chapter, is that the two places where you might expect to find more of a critical or systematic interrogation of that, you don't really find it, right? One being in terms of feminist, radical feminist politics, Black feminist politics. We don't see a whole lot of attention paid to monogamy, and also queer and Black queer studies and queer theory. We don't see a lot of interrogation of compulsory monogamy. And so I in the chapter, there's a place where I realized, okay, if I'm going to do one, I have to talk about the other. That is just as I came to conclude that we're not monogamous by nature, but by compulsion. I think we're not heteronormative by nature either, but by compulsion. Again, when you look at indigenous cultures, there's a much wider range of sexualities, both in terms of non-monogamy, but also non-heteronormativity, or queer, what we would think of in this modern, Western urban civilization, so-called, as queer. But of course, there's contradictions, right? And so, yeah, as you mentioned, Harrison, as much as he had a certain sex radicalism, there is that comment that he makes that seems to be homophobic against Virgin Islander women who are lesbians. I didn't really know what to make of that. I think, my explanation was just that, yeah, like Harrison, like anyone else, any other one of us, was beset with contradictions and was, striving for liberation in a world that had so many things arrayed against him, especially when it comes to Black sexual liberation in the Jim Crow era, that, he just, for whatever reason, either, and it's weird because he had same gender loving male friends like Langston Hughes, like Claude McKay, like Richard Bruce Nugent. But then this comment about lesbian women is kind of like he's looking down on them, right? And so yeah, it could just be a sexist thing, like he was willing to countenance same gender love among men, but not among women. I think more likely it was just kind of one of those moments where he felt shut out for some reason. Like, he probably wanted a wider range of options and on the dance floor and wasn't seeing them. But I think the point here being that yeah, why, like, as much as if we're going to critique heteronormativity, or we're going to take the questions of queer liberation or LGBT equality or whatever you want to call it, if we're going to take that seriously, why aren't we thinking more critically about compulsory monogamy? Because in some ways, I think the free lovers were ahead of free love actually encompasses queerness in a sense, right? In the sense that if free love means you're going to love who you want, when you want, however much you want, and no one's going to stop you. That includes, loving people of the same gender, right? It also includes loving many people who may not be of the same gender. It's a very broad kind of umbrella. And so, yeah, I hope that this chapter really sparks these conversations and takes us beyond the kind of standard issue, if I can call it that, standard issue queer liberation politics or standard issue radical Black feminist politics. Again, neither of which seem to me to have adequately interrogated this question of monogamy in romantic and sexual life.
Well, I think, we got more questions. There's also a political economy question to me, right? Because if you're disrupting, because so much of monogamy is about property and patriarchy. And so if there's like no limits on who you can love, that also means like, how can you divest your resources? It does not have to be through the bourgeois family structure. It's like, I can have whatever, marriage is an economic relationship, but to the extent that we're making these contractual relationships, I can make that with a friend or, who I want to support financially or get rid of that altogether. But I think that it also is a question of resources, right? As most social norms in capitalist society are, they come down to like how resources are distributed, who gets access and privileges and who gets exceptions. So go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that's another reason why when we're talking about Black liberation specifically, or Pan-African liberation, or socialist politics, the whole nuclear family ideology that monogamy sort of relates to isn't really ours, right? It's something of, by, and for the ruling class, in fact. But Africans, we always lived in a more collective way, right? It takes a village to raise a child. We never had this sort of rigid familial structures that sort of white Western Europe developed in terms of, the nuclear family and stuff like that. We had plural marriage on the continent. We had a whole range of sexualities that were non-monogamous and non-heteronormative. I mean, we just had a whole other, much more collective way of being. And I think that relates to the collective nature of our struggle, the collective nature of working class struggle and politics. And yeah, I mean, that's the resources, being able to share resources or not actually is very much related to this question of monogamy. And that's why I think we can't or will reach true liberation if we don't also deal with this question.
So you mentioned, just different norms in what I would call, I don't like pre-colonial, so like classical Africa, right? So that leads to this sort of a good transition to talking about Harrison's relationship to Africa. So in chapter 5, you talk about how he had a relatively unique perspective on Africa for the time, namely that he didn't have a paternalistic attitude toward the continent or have this misconception that the continent needed to be civilized by the diaspora, needed to be developed by Africans in the diaspora. So can you speak more about what shaped Harrison's perspective on Africa and how it compared to his contemporaries like Garvey or Du Bois?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he did have a very, very unique relationship to Africa, right? I mean, and this started from a young age. I think the first thing that shaped his mindset, there were a number of factors, but the first thing was his upbringing on the Caribbean island of St. Croix, because he writes about and was clearly quite conscious about the fact that the mangoes and soursops and sugar apples and bananas and yams and okra that people were growing in the garden of his plantation and the people around him in St. Croix, that these were akin to the fruits and vegetables that you would find in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia and Cameroon and Nigeria. Second of all, he read a lot of books about Africa. So in addition to his upbringing in a sort of African or African descended Caribbean context, he read, newspapers from the Gold Coast, from Sierra Leone, from South Africa. He read a lot of books about Africa. He would write book reviews about books on Africa. He served as secretary for the Negro Society of Historical Research under Arturo Schomburg and Johnny Bruce, who were kind of these Pan-Africanist mentors of his that really helped guided and shaped his studies of African history and literature and so on. I mean, Schomburg, as people, will know, had a wealth, not just of books, but of knowledge about Africa, which Harrison openly admitted was 8 or 10 times greater than his own. So Harrison looked up to people like Schomburg. And then, of course, Harrison's free thinking and anti-imperialist politics positioned him to reject the kind of paternalistic Christian and civilizational discourses, which he understood to be part and parcel of the machinery of colonialism, right? And unfortunately, a lot of Black thinkers, not just in the 19th century, but even into the early 20th, kind of adopted a similarly colonialist or paternalist attitude towards continental Africans. So, for example, when Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood founded the UNIA in 1914, one of their official objectives for the organization was to, quote, assist in civilizing the backward tribes of Africa. And Du Bois, similarly, after World War I, he was demanding that the African colonies that Germany had lost in the war be handed over to be governed by responsible, i.e. talented 10th Negro leaders from the West. And so these are examples that I share because these are some of the most prominent people we associate with Pan-Africanism in this time. But yet they at least initially started out with similarly colonialist and paternalist views about the need to civilize Africans from the outside. Now, to their credit, they did change. By the mid-20s, both Garvey and Du Bois abandoned the kind of paternalism that they had held prior to that. But Harrison, had already for years been speaking about the need not to teach Africans, but for us to learn what they have to teach us, which really turned the whole train of paternalistic thinking on its head. And it's difficult to overstate how deep the paradigm shift is here, right? Because this is a time when the Bronx Zoo had placed a Congolese man, Otabenga, in the monkey house section of the zoo. At this moment, Harrison is openly identifying himself as an untamed, untamable African, and he's pledging himself to the redemption of Mother Africa in his diary and stuff like that. So it's a fascinating, I think, paradigm shift because after this moment, World War I, post World War I, 1920s, that's when we start to see more and more people relinquish this kind of paternalistic attitude toward Africa and Africans and realize that actually the continent has a lot to teach us and that African liberation is not going to actually come from the outside, but it's going to come from within, that Africans themselves are the chief and primary authors of their liberation.
So I want to have maybe a little bit of a full circle kind of question now at this point, and thinking about some of the fact that you lost your own job because of some of your advocacy on Palestine, and thinking about Harrison's work to build the Colored International and ways of thinking about the connectedness between Africa, Asia, Southwest Asia, or the Middle East, the Americas. I wonder what lessons in both, like what lessons Harrison teaches and what you from your process of learning sort of more deeply about Harrison's contributions, what lessons can we learn from Harrison's work to build the Colored International, or how we think about our relationship to Palestine, what's happening in Israel and Iran at the moment? So I wonder if we can bring those things into conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, Harrison, he envisioned what he called the Colored International as an alliance, a global alliance of colonized people of the world against capitalism and imperialism and white supremacy, global white supremacy. And I think, although that was a century ago, understanding the ongoing interconnectedness of white supremacy and imperialism and the capitalist world economy couldn't really be more urgent, given the crises in Gaza and Iran, and so many other places. Harrison lived through World War I, which he called the White World War. And we're on a path to World War III, right? So yeah, there's a lot of overlaps. There's a lot of lessons to draw out. I think the most important one is that we're still menaced by the same general system, right? Capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist system that Harrison was contending with in his day. And so his call for a global, international that was conscious of this and actually fighting this particular enemy of white monopoly capitalist imperialism is still relevant. It remains a task yet to be completed, right? And I think that what we're seeing in places all over the world is the potential for solidarity against this system. We see struggle in places from Kenya last year. I was, part of the massive Gen Z rebellion in Kenya that shook the government to its core. Palestine, of course, and so many other places. I think anti-imperialism is really critical in this moment, and I'll share more about that in a bit because I have a quote that I think we'll get to. But this matters for us because we are essentially dealing with the same system, although it's changed its form and it's changed its kind of skin in different places. It's still at its core the same system that Harrison was fighting. So his call for a global movement against that system, I think, is just as relevant as ever. I think you're muted, Charisse. I can't hear you.
What was being alluded to by Brian in terms of quotes was that for this kind of this half of the interview, we are going to ask him to pull out passages based on like different prompts. So we have about 20 minutes. Just keep that in mind. And we have like 6 of them. So we'll get through as many as possible. But I want you all to get a feel for like the language, the texture, the arguments in the book. So we want him to do some reading. So first prompt is, what is a passage in your book that conveys how Hubert Harrison might respond to U.S. imperialism in our current moment?
Perfect. So this builds sort of directly on what we were just talking about in terms of the Colored International. And so I'm just going to read this passage. This is from page 189. I'm describing basically Harrison's theory and analysis of the aftermath of the World War I. And what Harrison, and so, this is from the middle of 149. He says, after dominating within their home territory, the capitalist countries had united internationally to harmonize their domination of the non-white world, such that, as Harrison put it, quote, the subject races and the subject classes are tied to each other like Kilkenny cats in a conundrum of conflict which they cannot escape until the system which so binds them both is smashed beyond possibility of reconstruction. And thus it becomes the duty of the darker races to fight against the continuance of this system from without and within. Here was the crux of his call to action, linking working people and people of color all over the world in a race-conscious, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist struggle to smash the reigning system beyond any possibility of reconstruction. Because white domination and imperialism were an international problem, it would require an international solution. For starters, quote, and this is a Harrison quote, a call should be issued for a Congress of the darker races, which should be frankly anti-imperialistic and should serve as an international center of cooperation from which strength may be drawn for the several sections of the world of color, unquote. Harrison argued that this Congress should include the voices of oppressed people from places like India, Egypt, China, West and South Africa, the West Indies, Hawaii, the Philippines, Afghanistan, Algeria, and Morocco. Basically this idea that, capitalist imperialism was menacing the whole world at that time, as it is now. And when we're talking about the situation today, I mean, having clarity about U.S. imperialism, I think, is one of the most important political sort of principles for people to really develop and take seriously, because the U.S. is taking us on a path to World War III, right? I mean, this whole escalation with Iran, people get confused about, is Trump going to do this or that, not seeing that there's a bigger system in place, right, which for decades has been menacing Iran, that the U.S. has had aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf for decades, that it has had bases in the Middle East for decades, that it has, right, this design on the region, the most oil-rich region of the world. That's something that is only going to benefit the U.S. ruling class, the oil companies, the arms industry, the military industrial complex. not US workers, and certainly not Iranian workers or Iraqi workers or Libyan workers who have all been, in various ways sanctioned, invaded, destroyed, bombed by US imperialism. And so yeah, I think this is a really crucial takeaway from Harrison is just having a principled anti-imperialist politics.
No, I think that's really important. And I think it's also, I might be projecting here, but I think it also is attached to why you decide to label Harrison a genius. And so for those of you who get to read the book later on, you'll see your discussion of genius and why. But I wanted to ask you to pull out a passage that describes or demonstrates what you feel like is Harrison's forbidden Black genius.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let me go to page 8. I mean, there's a lot I could say here, and I hope folks read the book and get the full argument. But yeah, on page 8, I'm talking about sort of the forbidden aspect. What I mean when I say forbidden genius. And so I say, Harrison's example makes hallowed myths into hollow creeds, like a touchstone revealing the impurities of the metal that it touches. After all, he criticized the socialists, the Garvey movement, and the so-called Harlem Renaissance from within, and in ways that revealed an embarrassing gap between what they practiced and what they preached. For some, his very existence created too much cognitive dissonance, a phenomenon that journalist Pam Atherton describes so perfectly. Quote, sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with the core belief, unquote. Much of the erasure and marginalization of Harrison in the history books flows from the way his example creates cognitive dissonance for so many orthodoxies of political thought. And so here's a place where, yes, there's a generative aspect of Harrison's work in terms of his crystallizing new political ideas and formations, but oftentimes those ran up against what existed before in ways that made those folks uncomfortable, right? So when he's critiquing the Socialist Party on its failure to take Black workers seriously, that stings the Socialist Party, but it also stings their historians. And so because the party didn't want to remember Harrison, the historians of the party don't often remember Harrison. Similarly for the Garvey movement, right? Like Harrison plays a decisive role in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism. And also he becomes quite a unique and incisive critic of Marcus Garvey. So Garvey and Garveyists didn't want to remember Harrison. And so their historians didn't want to remember Harrison either. This is the forbidden aspect of Harrison, right? Is that because he presents uncomfortable truths to many of the sort of established pillars of not just mainstream political thinking, but oppositional political thinking, right? The socialist and communist tradition, the Garveyist tradition, the free thinking tradition. It makes him a kind of almost like kryptonite, right, for people's gods. But also that's why I think it's so fascinating to study him, because, the very fact of his being forbidden, in a sense, is itself telling, right? Is itself suggestive that there's something here we need to pay attention to, because why else would people want to marginalize Harrison or sweep him under the rug and sort of move on and talk about something else?
Okay. So what is a passage in the book that reflects Hubert Harrison's singular and unique contribution to radical Black political thought?
So here I'm going to take a passage from page 5. This is the introduction as well. I say near the top of the page, I say Harrison's legacy defies easy categorization and cannot be pigeonholed into any single political framework. His propensity for shattering orthodox categories and taking radical thought beyond a boundary requires one to study many different traditions in order to fully understand and appreciate his ideas and actions. Because he integrated socialist, Black internationalist, free-thinking, sexually liberated, and African-centered valences of political radicalism, people familiar with any one or none of these frameworks who study Harrison have an opportunity to rethink the relationship of each of these formulations in light of each other. I think that's a singular contribution from Harrison to radical Black political thought, because he's not a one-note Johnny, right? He's not just a Black socialist or just a colored internationalist or just a free thinker or just a free lover or just an untamed, untamable African. He's all of these things. And a lot of us, I think, a lot of people stand in one or another of these camps, right? Or maybe two of these camps, or maybe even three of these camps. But when you have all of them in one figure, it's like, okay, let's actually understand more deeply how sexual liberation is connected to class consciousness and class struggle, right? Let's actually understand why African identity shifts how we are thinking about free thinking and the critique of Christianity, right? Let's actually, so all these kind of interconnections, I think, are something unique about Harrison, because there's very few figures who are sort of running the gamut of all these different radicalisms at the same time, right? Or giving us an opportunity to think through them all in one breath.
I feel like a lot of the thinkers probably are open to those ideas, but I think what makes Harrison unique in this regard is how much he wrote publicly about his relationship to all these. Wrote publicly, spoke publicly, as opposed to what we get as a very, I think, curated canon from other folks. Okay, so continuing this, right? What is a passage in the book that makes a convincing case for non-monogamy, right? And so this could be in reference to sort of the intellectual or political non-monogamy, but also or in reference to the kind of free love, free thinking politics.
Yeah, sure. So this, one of the challenging things about writing that chapter, I'm gonna read a quote from page 203. But just before I do, I'll say one of the things that was challenging is Harrison, although he did write a lot and left us a rich documentary archive, his free love politics is not something that we have a lot of documentation about. I had to reconstruct his ideas about this based on his influences, based on people he was around, his social circles. And so this is in the section of the chapter where I talk about someone called Edwin C. Walker, who was one of Harrison's mentors and sort of a veteran free thinker, free speecher, free lover, who wrote a pamphlet called Variety versus Monogamy. And so, yeah, I'll just read the passage and then maybe we can talk about it. I say, in the final analysis, the cultural coercion of compulsory monogamy inhibited human development. Walker believed that no single romantic partner was likely to be able to fulfill all of another person's emotional, intellectual, spiritual, financial, romantic, social, political, and sexual needs. And if humans have a variety of needs, then in order to fully meet those needs, we need some degree of variety in our relationships. This revealed compulsory monogamy not to be an advanced or more highly evolved form of relationship, as white anthropologists argued, but one that was constraining and backward. For instance, a highly developed woman or man might require many individuals to be fully complemented and supported in their own development. Walker's argument conjured a vision of non-monogamy with the potential for collective harmonization of the masculine and feminine energies throughout society by way of an expansive conception of love that could bring the inherent social interdependence of human connection and community to a higher level of development. The conclusion, therefore, wrote Walker, must be that monogamy represents a comparatively undeveloped physical, emotional, intellectual, and social state. Compulsory monogamy effectively shackles our potential for higher human evolutionary development. I mean, this is like the crux of the argument, right? I mean, there's a lot of other elements to the argument, but I think, Harrison was clearly reading Walker's pamphlets, taking in these arguments. We don't know exactly what Harrison said about free love, but I think this gives us an indication of the kind of milieu of ideas that the white sex radicals were, taking in and sharing and discussing. And it's something that I think really kind of, in that sense, kind of gives us a flavor of what free lovers were arguing. And then I added onto that, of course, some of the other elements of African's politics, his socialist politics, his African-centered politics, right, to try to sort of flesh it out more fully. But yeah, people, I think that chapter alone, hopefully, is like worth the book, right, or makes the book worth it. And so I really do hope people can get the full chapter, because it's a complicated argument, and it takes a number of elements to really lay it out in its fullness.
I think Sharice is probably going to take us home with the last quote. We probably won't get to that one, but I just wanted to comment that the joke right before that passage had me very, very tickled. How most Protestants acknowledge the morality of remarriage after the death of a spouse, thus practically announcing themselves in favor of monogamy here, but of polygamy in heaven. That actually really had me tickled. I'm gonna let have the last one.
Yeah.
I'm going to read them both, and then you can choose which one you want to do. So one is, what is one passage in the book that you struggled with or went back and forth on including in the book, and why? Or what is a passage in the book that you are most proud of and or crystallizes the life legacy of Hubert Harrison?
Yeah, that last question, I struggled with it. Because it's really, and this is another piece of feedback I got about my book trailer. If folks haven't seen my book trailer, maybe somebody could put that in the chat, or I don't know if y'all can.
I got it. I have it queued up. So I'll put it
awesome. Yeah, or maybe you can even put a link in the description on the YouTube when this comes out, because one of the pieces of feedback I got there was like, oh, it's too long. Could you have done something like 30 seconds or 60 seconds? And I was kind of like, well, you can't really fit Hubert Henry Harrison into 30 seconds or 60 seconds, right? I mean, you can try, but it's going to do some injustice and not really explain this person in his fullness. So yeah, I hope people can get the book for the last question you asked. But in terms of passages that I struggled with or sort of went back and forth with, okay, I'll read the passage about. This is on page 191, where I'm talking about his personal romantic life. I say, well, okay, I don't even really need to read the passage, but basically I'll read a short bit and then say why this was challenging. I say, as a wider Black erotic awakening caught on in Harlem in the 1920s, Hubert Harrison would encounter perhaps the most passionate lover of his life, Elsie Dearborn. He would also cultivate romance with high-profile women, including Amy Ashford Garvey and the famous sculptress Augusta Savage.
What?
Yeah.
I know that.
Yes. And by the way, I also mentioned before that paragraph that he's married, that he has kids, that he's co-parenting and, moving out of the house and struggling with his marriage. So in other words, the whole area of his personal romantic and sexual life is a place that was really challenging, because I realized, like, there were certain things I could have shared that I didn't. And I didn't know initially how to handle that whole area, because obviously there's a relationship between his Black free love politics and the critique of monogamy and so on, and his personal life and his marriage and his love life. But, to go into depth on some of that stuff, as much as it might be sort of salacious and tantalizing for the reader, I felt like I needed to be careful about what I share of other people's business, even though, he's been dead for a century. Because I thought to myself, well, what if someone was writing about me and like sharing all my business even after I'm dead? Like, I don't know that I would really appreciate that or want that. So in other words, I tried to get the balance right between like mentioning or at least touching on that there is a personal side of this story, right? That he is married, that he loves his wife to the end, no matter how many lovers he has, no matter who, whatever else happens, he still loves Lynn. They even have a child in 1920, which is years after they have, sort of stopped cohabiting. So there's a balance between, on the one hand, like mentioning those personal things, but on the other hand, kind of doing so with tact and with a kind of judicious sense of what is even ethical to share about somebody's very personal business, even though they're long since passed away. And that challenged me. And ultimately what I decided, as you can tell from reading the chapter, I decided to focus mainly on the intellectual arguments and trying to build out what a Black free love politics from Harrison looked like, as opposed to going into a lot of details about his marriage or about his lovers or about his love style, which was kind of how the chapter started. Like if you look at the early drafts, it was like mostly personal stuff. And then over time, I sort of like honed it and revised it and like got it to where it is, where it ultimately ended up.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian. I feel like we learned a lot about the book, about your politics, and I really look forward to reading the book more closely now that we've had the conversation. Where can people find it?
Really excited about the book too.
Yeah.
So. Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Layla and Charisse. This has been really a perfect opportunity for me to sort of share some excerpts from the book and talk about it. I would suggest people get it directly from the UNC Press website. There's a code you can use, 01CP30. 01UNCP30.
Oh, wait, 01
capital UNCP 30. That's you can save 30% at checkout. It's also available, wherever books are sold as well. But this will be a nice sort of direct from publisher discounted way to get the book. It's available in paperback and hardcover. I'm really proud of this book. I just want to say lastly that, I spent over a decade on this project. Started out as my PhD dissertation and, has now become a book. So it's got a piece of me. Like you're not just buying a book, like you're buying a piece of my heart and soul, like it's my testament. It is my magnum opus. I'm just really excited to finally be in a position to share it. And I look forward to further engagements and further discussions. Because I know, like Charisse, we'll be on a panel about the book at Aswad.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hitting the conference circuit hard, and I'm hopefully coming soon to a bookstore near you, wherever you are in the country. So look me up on my website, briankwoba.com. I'm on Instagram at dr.kwoba. Those are all ways you can get more information about me and about the book.
And like you said, I will add the link to the trailer and the coupon code to the YouTube description box.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wasn't able to. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, I think we dropped it in the chat. Didn't you drop it in the chat?
I did. I dropped both of them in the chat. So I dropped the link and the coupon code in the chat, but I will, after this is all over, I will add it to the description.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, y'all. Thanks again.
Okay. Now we're going to get talked at by another man. I'm just kidding. Now we have somebody who is near and dear to my heart, somebody who is like one of my most fervent political mentors, one of the reasons why I'm in Black Alliance for Peace, Ajamu Baraka, and we are going to talk about what Israel's most recent aggression on Iran means for African people. Why? Because we hear all of this discourse about how that's happening over there, that's not Black folks' business, etc. Every form of imperialist aggression is Black folks' business because we are colonized and we are subjected to imperialism. So that is a conversation we're having. So if you have been living under a rock, Ajamu Baraka is a geopolitical analyst, organizer, writer, human rights defender, and veteran of the U.S. Black Liberation Movement with over 53 years of work in the United States and internationally. He is the founder of the Black Alliance for Peace and currently serves as the director of BAP's North-South Project for People-Centered Human Rights. Recently, Baraka co-founded the International Coalition to Stop Genocide in Gaza to support the South African case filed with the International Court of Justice. In 2016, Baraka was a candidate for vice president of the United States on the Green Party ticket. He currently serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and the leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition, or UNAC. He is an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and the recipient of the Serena Sherm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. In 2019, Baraka was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial's Peace Prize. So welcome, Ajamu. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to seeing the citation for that book. It sounds very exciting. I mean, I'm so excited now. I don't know if I can do this interview, but we it sounds like it's something that I want to delve into. But yeah, but thank you for the work that you both are doing, bringing this kind of information to the people, and serving as a source of critical alternative analysis, something that's critically important at this historical moment. So thank you.
Thank you for all that you do. And so just by way of getting us started, can you give us and our audience a brief overview of Israel's current aggression on Iran and how it relates to the war intensified genocide in Gaza and regime change in Syria as well?
Well, I think you're talking about living under a rock. I think most of us are aware of the fact that once again, we see another aggressive move by the United States and Israel. Both nations operate beyond the bounds of legality, meaning they are both outlaw states. And they have now launched on the latest adventure, which is to attack Iran, a purely unprovoked and, of course, illegal action. The intent, they claim, is to undermine a program for the weaponization of uranium, that is to build a nuclear bomb, a program that most people, including U.S. intelligence, says does not exist. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu pretended that Iran was not only pursuing the production of a nuclear weapon, but that they were a mere weeks away from realizing that objective. Therefore, even in the midst of negotiations or so-called negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, Israel launched another illegal war against Iran, throwing the entire region and indeed parts of the world into complete disarray. And so we have another example of the kind of instability, the kind of collective threat to humanity that the actions of these two fascist states are involved in. And it has created a situation where if it's not resolved fairly quickly, there is no telling where it's going to go. Not only might it be a so-called endless war, it could end up being a very short war with a dangerous escalation as a consequence of the possibility of drawing in other participants, including the Chinese and even the Russians.
These genocidal maniacs. Okay, so how does this latest escalation in Southwest Asia actually impact the war in Sudan? Because I believe that one of the turning points for the government forces, for example, came in part from help from Iran, and we know that the UAE has been backing the RSF. So can you sort of talk about the correlation there?
Yeah, but I actually didn't answer all of that first question. Because we did want to begin to make that connection. It's important to begin to make that connection because when we talk about what impact might this have on African people in the U.S., we always make the connections between Africans in the U.S. and Africans throughout the African nation, and specifically Africans on the African continent. So one of the consequences of this kind of belligerence, this kind of warmongering that we see the U.S. involved in, is that it has a direct impact on the economic situation of working class people in general and African working class people specifically. We saw this with the proxy war in Ukraine, when Biden baited the Russians into invading Ukraine and the subsequent conflict. And many of our people were saying, well, this has nothing to do with us. This is someone else's battle. But very soon after the conflict started, what happens? Petroleum prices go up, meaning it's more expensive at the pump to buy gas. But more impactful, food prices start to escalate. And this is at the end of the crisis, not even the end, but as a continuation of the COVID crisis, the economic crisis that resulted in a further and deeper crisis for most of the people as a consequence of COVID. And so right on top of that shock, you had the disruption of supply chains, you had this runaway inflation. So that had an enormous impact on the material realities of people in the United States of America, and specifically for Black folks. And it's important to emphasize that because, people have to understand that when you talk about, we want to get free and our liberation, and you separate yourself from the struggles of other oppressed people, other colonized people, other exploited people exploited by capitalism. You don't understand that we're talking about the same structures, the same system. Okay. So when we raise up the issue of internationalism, we're not trying to be cute or hip. We are suggesting that you can't understand our realities. You can't understand objective reality unless you contextualize it, unless you understand these fundamental relationships. So Ukraine had a detrimental impact on us, and this situation with this latest adventure, the attack on Iran, is going to have an impact on us not only in the U.S. but it has an impact on the African continent. That the U.S. maneuvering in West Asia, and just so people remember, we talk about West Asia, we're talking about the so-called Middle East, which is the colonial concept. Part of what happened was that you have this revolutionary process in Sudan, where they finally got rid of a leadership that was in alignment and often with the West, even though they pretended to be in opposition. This leadership in Sudan was responsible for horrific violence directed against African people, particularly in Darfur. And you had this leadership disposed, and you had the people themselves beginning to organize themselves to transform their realities, transform their societies. But then you had it hijacked, undermined by the military. You had two factions of the military. I don't know we're going to go into, I'm getting ready to go into a lot of detail, but very briefly, you had two military elements. You had of course, the Sudan military, and then you had what got incorporated into the Sudan military, the so-called rapid help me, rapid support forces. Okay, that were started off as a militia. They were the ones that were the cutting edge of the war in Darfur, but they began to be part of the official military in Sudan. They pulled off a coup. They undermined the civilian revolutionary process, and then they began to battle among themselves. Okay, and that's where we are today. Now, part of the connection is this: that the Trump administration negotiated a pact that was supposed to represent a new configuration of power in West Asia, and that was the so-called Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords brought into its process Sudan. It was a process to identify these reactionary states that the U.S. could coalesce with and could force a recognition between them and a normalization between them and Israel. Okay, and the objective there was to continue to build a coalition of states with the objective of undermining Iran. Okay, So the connection was there in that sense. Just recently, because of this battle between those two factions, we see that the Sudan military reestablished relationships with Iran, and as a consequence, we see that Iran was able to provide some critical military equipment that seemed to help to turn the tide in the battle in Sudan. But let's keep in mind that even though the Sudan military appears now to be on the offensive, it still represents a real challenge to the people of Sudan, because even if the Sudan military is able to defeat the RSF, it doesn't resolve the issue of the configuration of popular power in Sudan. So my point is this: everything's connected, and we have to address these issues in that spirit, understanding all of these various connections. If we not only want to understand them, but if we want to devise our responses and the politics necessary that will reflect the objective realities we're trying to deal with, and in fact to transform. Sounds like a lot.
Well, I mean, it is a lot. Like, I don't know how you could answer any of these, like even begin to answer any of these questions without giving so much of the context. And I think that's really important. Whether we're overwhelmed by the details of the context, it's important, because I think it's something that in all of our interviews we are asking people, like, how, what sources are we following? How are we able to determine these sort of nuanced readings of conflicts that we are not on the ground to really understand without other people's interpretations of? So I thank you for that, and I think it's useful. You've already started to give us a sense of why, as African people, as Black people, we should care about these things, but I want to kind of continue this conversation about all of the ways in which these things are connected. So this year is going to be the 80th anniversary of the devastating bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I wanted to expand this conversation about the connectedness of these struggles to think about, to ask you, what should we as African people be considering about this what do you call it, the nuclear armament sort of proliferation, and this kind of race to determine who gets to have nuclear arms, who does not get to have. What kinds of things should we as African people be considering and paying attention to as these conversations about nuclear proliferation are happening?
I think there's two elements here. One of the planks of our No Compromise, No Retreat campaign, that is the Black Alliance of Peace, is that unlike many people, we were raising the issue and making people aware of the fact that there was a very significant movement developing globally to prohibit nuclear weapons. A new treaty that reflected that commitment, that international commitment to abolish all nuclear weapons. And we embraced that. And that became one of our major demands when we launched the Black Alliance of Peace in 2017. And we urge other elements of the so-called anti-war and anti-imperialist movement to embrace that notion, not only in terms of its objective principles, but the fact that it allowed us to begin to build new relationships among other forces that should be standing as anti-war and anti-imperialist, because we know that one of the major objectives of these states in acquiring nuclear weapons is not so much just self-defense, but also to be on the offensive. And we know, we've seen what happens when you have these weapons of mass destruction, along with a colonial attitude, a colonial mentality. And that's the second part of this, the connection. People who are not racialized as white, they are the people, us, who tend to be open to the most horrific treatment that one can imagine. We become killable. And so when we see that the US was able to acquire or develop a nuclear weapon, and that they wanted to demonstrate that they had this weapon, what did they do? They dropped dropped 2 bombs on the Japanese, who were already, and this is another connection, already involved in a negotiation to basically end the Second World War, the Second Imperialist War. But they wanted to demonstrate to the Soviet Union and to the world that they'd had this horrific weapon, and so they dropped these bombs on these people to demonstrate that power that they had in their hands. The fact that we have an ongoing genocide, that we had this attack, this ongoing attack now against Iran, is another example of the kind of treatment, the kinds of targeting of peoples racialized as non-white that characterizes this colonial relationship that we've got to undermine. That no one can convince me, I'm sure probably you all also, that the conditions that Palestinian people are facing every day in Gaza would be tolerated for 1 second if those people were racialized as white. No one in the West would tolerate an unprovoked attack, an illegal attack against another sovereign state if that state was perceived to be white. And we see the concrete evidence of that with how they went crazy when the Russians went into Ukraine, okay? But we want people to understand and be able to explain the difference. And what's the difference? Well, in one case with the Ukrainians and with the retaliation against the Israelis, these people are human. These are white people who are in fact human beings, and they have rights that human beings should have. Their nations are sovereign, and people should respect their sovereignty. But for us, for the racialized other, for Amalek in Palestine, the human animals, they have no rights that any white person needs to recognize and respect. Their nations are absent any kind of sovereignty and definitely don't deserve any kind of ability to be self-determinate. So you have this double standard that emanates from the normalization of white supremacy that is at the core of not only rationalizing these relationships, but at the core of our inability to organize effective opposition to it, because many of our friends on the left don't understand and can't embrace and don't want to deal with the fact that if we don't deal with this issue of normalized white supremacy, we're not going to build this glorious working class movement that people think that they're going to build without us in order to defeat this crazed and violent European bourgeoisie and its leadership that's based there in the United States of America. So, these are the kinds of relationships we have to raise, and they are the kinds of the framework we need to understand in order to build and develop the oppositional politics that we have to create in order to not become victims again.
Or to end the ongoing victimization. So, I don't know that it's ended. Okay. So the Black Alliance for Peace put out the statement called "The Middle East is on fire because Israeli and U.S. imperialism lit the match." And in it states, quote, "The idea of Israel, the Zionist occupation, claiming a moral position is absurd. And the fact that the international community continues to give Israel any credibility is a dereliction of duty and forms a vacuum of morality for all of those who do not stand resolutely against its genocide in Palestine and its attacks on Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iran. Israel's immunity granted by Western colonial nations is a further reflection of the moral gulf between these states and the vast majority of humankind that subscribes to the values that uphold people-centered human rights, self-determination, and dignity." Unfortunately, there are Africans in the belly of the beast who are absolutely providing Israel cover. So can you talk about how Africans here in the United States and perhaps elsewhere have provided cover for the Zionist entity, and how can we combat that propaganda?
Well, how we combat it is by building oppositional movement. And I mean, if you look at that statement, and you know, maybe I might be a little biased, but have you seen a statement with that kind of clarity come from almost anybody? I mean, there's some good statements out there, but it's important that that kind of analysis emanates from an independent African formation, because that statement reflects the kind of internationalism that we're talking about, the kind of contextualization that has to take place in order to understand not only the world, but to understand how these events impact us wherever we may be in the African world and in the world in general. So it means that we have to continue to do the internal political education and the organization that's necessary to build power. When we talk about building organization, the objective is to build power, to build popular power. And so when we have popular power, when we have organization, then we can confront the neoliberal class that's put in place to lord over us, to keep the natives in place. We can engage them, and we can defeat them because they are relatively weak. We're just weaker right now because of our lack of organization. So we have to confront this class. We have to confront the ideals that emanate from this neo-colonial petty bourgeois and bourgeois class. We are talking about a struggle for consciousness. Consciousness is a legitimate, I think, critical terrain of struggle. And so we agitate and we propagandize, if you will. We confront all of the backwardness that we see before us with boldness and with conviction. That's the task as we continue to build. So it's a difficult one because, look, the objective reality is African people in the U.S. have moved significantly to the right. And that's not to condemn our people. I mean, you know, our people have been subjected to a 50-year counter-revolutionary process. And we see the results of it. That process was consolidated. That the culmination of it occurred under Barack Hussein Obama. Okay, and basically, you know, that's what we have to deal with. That's the subjective realities we have to deal with. And so we are prepared to take that on, and we have been taking that on as a formation. And I think the correctness of our approach, I think, is reflected in our practice. The fact that we have a formation. We didn't just think about things and talk about things. We didn't talk about the need for Black left unity. We built structures that represent a movement toward building more effective Black left unity. Okay. Now, some people might have issues with how we do it. They might have issues with how we deal with our internal politics, and that's all right. We say if there's better ways of doing it, then we think people should do it. And we either will step to the side or join. Well, right now we got a whole lot of people running their mouths and not doing a whole lot. So my point is, yes, we struggle and we build and we consolidate our core. And from that core, we're able to not only consolidate our people, but we can reposition ourselves as the leadership in the revolutionary process in North America that we have to assume. Without the objective leadership of the African revolutionary process, left politics in the U.S. goes nowhere.
You know,
and we say that, and we say it without apology.
Yeah. You know, I'm thinking about the issue of positionality. You know, there's all these people who are talking about, you know, Black folks, we need to sit this one out, right? But what we also know when we're talking about like the ramping up of military aggression, because of the because of the end of the, compulsory draft, what we know is that in terms of the military in the US, it is very much a poverty draft that leads to the sort of rank and file of the masses of military to be poor Black folks, in addition to, other folks too. And so I wonder, in thinking specifically about the folks who are joining the military, their ideas about what the military might do for them in terms of their own limited political mobility in the scope of the U.S. But what might you say to Black troops and not just the troops themselves, right? But the entire sort of ecosystem around sort of Black troops, like the families that support them, the people that sort of make their livings off of them, about what's happening as the sort of Israel ramps up its aggression towards Iran, and then to the so-called Black civilian logics about us sitting this one out as Black people.
Well, first I would say that as a Black vet myself, the position that we take, have always taken, is to help young Africans understand who they are and the correct relationship they should have to this structure that they now find themselves involved in. I would share with them, have shared with people in the past, our response to the Israel-Egyptian War of 1973. That basically, when they put us on alert in Germany, we had numbers of our people who were not going to deploy, because we were absolutely clear that this wasn't our fight. We weren't going to sit it out, because you couldn't just sit it out. You had to basically flee. But we understood that we were not going to go into the so-called Middle East to fight for Zionism. And we had done enough internal political education that people understood exactly why this wasn't our struggle. And people have to understand there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of potential with these young Africans in the military. Many of them are backwards, no question about that. But many of them, because of their concrete experiences coming out of the working class, and because you see the contradictions in the military, the racial contradictions, and you began to be exposed to some people who are actually attempting to understand the world, there is a lot of budding consciousness there. Unfortunately, again, though, we don't have the kind of support structures we had back in the day, because back in the day, someone like myself, who was an organizer in the military, I had support structures all around me. So when the company commander would call me into the office, because of work that we were doing, I call up my lawyer. And I tell the company commander, I'm coming to see you, but I'm bringing my lawyer also. Okay. We don't have those kind of structures like we had back in those days, but we have to build those, because we're not going to allow our folks to engage in war crimes. And if you find yourself on the ground, on the side of Israel, then you are involved in war crime activity, especially if you find yourself in Gaza, which could still be a possibility. So we're not going to allow that, and we're going to build the capacity to be able to resist that. So again, the long or maybe shorter answers, all of this always, it sounds like a cliche, but sometimes this stuff is quite obvious. We've got to continue to build independent organization. We've got to have the capacity to develop organizers. We have to create experiences for people to become steeled in opposition. And that is our responsibility. That is the responsibility of these new generations, because whatever's going to happen, it's going to happen in you all's lifetime. That's no exaggeration. Unfortunately, I think that there's going to be a period of intense a stage of fascism. There's no question about that. We're already in it, but it's going to become even more intense. Our ability to survive that and to actually be in a position to go on the offensive is going to be reflected in the degree in which we can organize ourselves. And I have no doubt because y'all some bad Africans, and we have skills and experiences that even we didn't have starting out back in the late 1960s or early 1970s.
I know you were being specific about the war crimes thing, but also like I feel like we're also just at a different point in history, and I understand what the poverty draft does and why people still continue to go into the military. But is there any way to be in the military and not be involved in war crimes, particularly the U.S. military?
Well, it depends if you get deployed. I mean, and then when people understand their rights, I was what they called a shithouse lawyer. That I was a people's lawyer. And so, for example, you can at any point file CO status, conscientious objector status. Okay. And so if you are being faced with a deployment that you don't want to engage in, you file your status. But see, people have to know what their rights are, even in the military. But you're right, it's a legitimate question. If you allow yourself to be deployed and put into a position where you actually are fighting, then yes, you're going to be committing war crimes. We had a lot of Africans that in fact did that. But we also had Africans that only resisted. One of the stories that people don't talk about much is the fact that we had Africans that went to the other side in almost every conflict that the U.S. engaged in, starting from the external conflicts, well, not even external, but the conflicts in the rampage that the colonialists were involved in as they fought from sea to sea from the East Coast to the West Coast in the wars against the indigenous. But then certainly, even when they completed that process and started off with their wars in the Pacific, with the Filipino War, for example, you had a number of Africans who didn't come home from the Philippines in every conflict from that. So there's always been also another reality.
It's the War of 1812. Gerald's book about the War of 1812, the Counter Revolution of 1776. What you mean? 1588? Exactly. Like we've been the subversive shit. So okay. Anything else you want to share on this great Juneteenth? Happy Juneteenth, by the way, y'all. We haven't talked about Juneteenth at all. So what's a good Juneteenth message you want to us Africans in the belly of the beast to end on? Or is there anything else?
I want to tell y'all, when y'all bring me back, I want more than 30 minutes. So that's okay. First thing we're gonna talk about.
You were so disciplined. I'm actually shocked. I know Erica's shocked too, but I'm so, you were very disciplined in your answer. Rigorous, but disciplined. We love it.
Well, I try to be. But no, this is, I got mixed feelings about this Juneteenth thing, Yes. We don't need the enemy giving us no holidays or interpreting our history for us. Okay. We'll take it. It's a day that some people can get off, but I don't go further than that. I'm saying in Juneteenth, let us continue to struggle, because even though it was announced that we were so-called free, we weren't free at all. It was just a different stage we had to face. So we say the revolutionary opposition of our people, the anti-colonial struggle of our people continues. And that is the responsibility that we have to continue that fight. And we say on Juneteenth or any other day, we remind ourselves of that responsibility.
Well, I guess, the good news for some is that we probably won't even have Juneteenth next year with this.
You probably won't.
So enjoy your day off while you can.
Exactly. We may not be here next year.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ajamu.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you. Y'all take it easy.
Peace.
Okay. Now we got one more task at hand, and that is to discuss a very intriguing email we were sent by one of our very own from the chat, Ashy Knuckles. Okay, so should we might need to take it like paragraph by paragraph.
That's fine.
Okay, so it starts. Hey, LSR, at 2 a.m., I was watching a lecture about liberalism and fascism in connection with the Trump administration. It got me thinking more broadly about the mainstream conversation of fascism happening right now. Below are my thoughts at 2 a.m. Please don't judge me. So this is the first chunk. There seems to be a heightened discussion about what is fascism in everyday conversation as it relates to Trump, with people debating if this administration is fascist, has fascist tendencies, is the second coming of Hitler, or just a baboon with a razor blade. I feel the mainstream conversation misses the mark because even if people do or don't arrive at the conclusion that this administration is fascist, the conversation rarely reaches a structural analysis of this is how a settler colonial project / imperialism operates. And the mainstream people I am referring to include the liberal virtue signaling, clutch my pearls if a black man walks by while a white woman's wait, hold on. I am referring to includes a liberal virtue signaling, clutch my pearls if a black man walks by while wine mom, hands off protesters, 92% silk press helmet, cop mala, I told you so brigade, mainstream media pundit class, terminally online disgruntled formal Bernie bro lefties that won't organize but stay having hot takes, and even some radical spaces that are increasing discussions of fascism to a new generation of organizers.
I'm not judging you, but I definitely can see you sitting here going, just.
All right. So let me just read the rest, and then you can do so this is part of her first thing.
Okay.
All right. So is imperialism, colonization, neocolonialism, apartheid, chattel slavery not fascist? Is this a conflation, or can these concepts have their own distinct definitions and simply represent the contradictions of capitalist accumulation? Is it just the Eurocentric way of viewing 20th century fascism as exceptional, an aberration in time in which fascism can only be viewed in this way, a way that excludes the Namibian genocide, centuries-long assault on the DRC and Haiti, transatlantic slave trade, indigenous genocide for European land expropriation, etc.? A way where hands-off protesters can acknowledge Trump as Hitler while simultaneously longing to protect NATO imperialist, maybe fascist conquest that upholds military occupation of African people and others globally. Lord help me, my brain is about to explode. All right, so let's stop here and so this is the first sort of query.
Okay.
Whither fascism? Well, I sort of gestured at this when I talked on the opening plenary at Embrock, right? That this is a long-standing discussion about whether the U.S. is fascistic, fascist-like, fascist adjacent, neo-fascist, right? That this is the conversation. And generally speaking, when people are talking about neo-fascism, they're talking about Trumpism. Then there's a broader analysis of the U.S. as constitutively fascist because of settler colonialism, slavery, et cetera, which you mentioned. And then there is a sort of argument about sort of the U.S. having its own fascistic character, but not necessarily being fascist as such. And I don't really necessarily take a position on this for some of the reasons that you raised, whereby I don't think that fascism is a unique evil, especially if we take into account imperialism, colonialism, enslavement, indigenous genocide, et cetera, where to me it becomes important is in terms of political clarity, because I do think the way that we understand a given phenomenon impacts what it is we think is to be done, right? So, for example, if we reduce U.S. fascism to Trumpism, then that does not necessarily lead to the conclusion that we need to overthrow the state as such. That leads to the conclusion that we can get rid of Trump and we're fine. Whereas if you think that the U.S. is constitutively fascist because of its settler colonial origins and all the things, then that will require a sort of overthrow or dismantling, whatever you want to call it, a revolutionary solution to the problem. So, yes.
I don't think I need to add anything to that. So I will go into the second part. Secondly, is there even utility in debating the definition of what this administration is when generally people aren't believing their own analyses anyway, as evidenced by the capture of people's energy into neoliberal, neutralizing, hands-off protests and Bernie AOC sycophants? I have family that obsessively asserts that Trump is Hitler and routinely watch documentaries on Hitler and tell me Hitler did this and so is Trump. Someone told me that they think literally Trump and Rubio want to be kings of the world. And I had to remind them that this imperial empire got its start in 1776, not 2016. And yet these people will make these assertions while continuing to sit on the couch and consume MSNBC and wait for the next general election. I do have some grace for them. What more can you expect from colonized Africans in the belly of the beast, getting their narratives from state TV and aren't able to articulate the definition or character of imperialism as weaponized against their own ancestors? Tactically, do we divert their focus from the Trump-Hitler connection to seeing a broader continuity of this administration with the American imperial project? or redefine what fascism is. Is fascism even a system, or just a manifestation / an iteration of the exploitative capitalist system at large? Is this all just splitting hairs? Please recommend any articles or books that may help me grapple with and understand these concepts and sharpen my analysis and understanding. This question is loaded as hell, so I'm absolutely content with you sending me off to do some readings if that's easier for you. I mean, I think that's still, that's still a continuation of the larger point that you were making. But I mean, I do to that. What was the specific part of the question? Like, do we direct people's energy elsewhere? I mean, I do think I think that's part of the conversation we were having with Ajamu about like why all these things matter. Being able to sort of make these sort of broader connections, and then too, I mean, like, I think it's also relevant to ask the questions like, okay, so Trump is Hitler, then what? Like, what does that mean? If that's true, what does that mean, and what do we do with that? And so does that mean people are saying we're just, descending into, concentration camps, and that's just our inevitable future? Like what does taking that line of thought to its logical conclusion really do for us in terms of figuring out what types of solutions we should have to these kinds of issues? But I do think that like the amount of alarm and concern that people have is an opportunity to shift people to other kinds of conversations about those things. And so I think, this conversation that we always have about meeting people where they are, and like understanding who the masses of our people are and what types of messages they're receiving. I think, again, when you talk about believing our own analyses, if we take that to be true, then we do have to look at these moments as opportunities to have expanded conversations about what we should be paying attention to, what kinds of solutions are possible. And I think these are like, not to, go into this particular argument and give too much credit for it, but like one of the things that happened around Bernie's campaign, right, was this uptick in public conversations about socialism. Now, yes, there were distortions and all these other kinds of things, but I do think it matters that there was a moment in time where we could talk about socialism in a public forum in ways that had not previously been possible, and I think we have to take advantage of those moments. You're muted.
Just acknowledging what Ricky's saying in the chat and other people commiserating. Like, basically, it's not even really our analysis of fascism. It's like your family basically stunning you. Like your family always seeing you as whatever member you are in that family, whether it's like, so it might be a sense that like nobody takes you seriously because you still just you, like your age relationship always remains. But it also might be like, oh, that's just the fucking wild-eyed radical, right? Like, that's just, oh, there she go talking that shit again. And that applies also to like your friend groups, for example. That's me and my friend groups, right? Because me and my mom have a very particular relationship where we talk about this stuff and, it's taken seriously, whatever. But like, I'm in a sorority and, I was at a different moment in my life when I joined the sorority. I have different politics now. And so it's like, oh, here she go again. And people will tell that, she's political. Like, it would be that type of shit. You know what I'm saying? It's like, hey, no, but actually, like, this is not just the rantings of a mad woman. Like, this actually like means something. And the other, Layla or Ricky saying like when she went on FD signifier. So like we were to go on like Consciously or something. Maybe people who consume that media like might take it seriously, or maybe not. Who knows, right? Or if we went on fucking Breakfast Club, right? But that there's and that's part of this. That also honestly is part of the celebrity culture and the influencer culture as well, right? Like if somebody else whatever, it has a stamp of authenticity, I guess, gives you a stamp, then you good or whatever. So
yeah, I mean, it's just making me think too about like, I mean, we've talked about this before, but like, at 9 years old, my parents were telling me explicitly not to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And then I think about, Kaepernick's whole kneeling situation. And now all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, this like makes all this sense. And not to say there are plenty of people who were doing it at that time and before and all these things, but it does matter when these things become somewhat mainstream in terms of people's willingness to be open to them. I mean, I think about that even in relationship to like, when my research in Venezuela, when people made those types of comments like before Chavez there were no Black people here, literally Chavez's personal identification as Afro-Indigenous created an opening whereby identifying as African or Afro-descendant became a greater possibility, which then opened up all these other political possibilities for Afro-descended peoples, to push the Bolivarian Revolution, to have more, to create more programs that serve Afro-Venezuelan people. And so as much as I think we think about these moments as like we reject the celebrity culture and all these other kinds, they do matter, and they are real spaces for potential change.
Sorry, I was reading this at the same time, but I think that that's right. So Kai was saying the way a conversation started on Burkina Faso with family on Father's Day, and they looked at me and were demanding my thoughts. LOL. Yeah, right. Like that's it can turn right. It can turn on a dime. Like all of a sudden, it's like, well, what's happening here? But I think, but so to get to some of your questions, for me, in terms of like, so fascism to me is not a system. It's a form of political administration. Like to me, colonialism is the political administration of imperialism. So this comes from Walter Rodney. Likewise, fascism is it's the way to govern a particular crisis of capitalism. And so, I don't know. So again, like I'm ambivalent about the U.S. as fascist question for reasons that I've described in many times elsewhere. But I do think, right, like again, part of what might be beneficial is like oftentimes when we talk about like, so for, you know, and this is emblematic of like people comparing Trump to Hitler, oftentimes we don't study semi-peripheral fascism. So fascisms that happened in like Portugal or the DR, that might be a better way for thinking about fascism in the United States, even though the United States is a quote unquote global power, like functionally, our actual economy is it's a third world economy. And so like, you know, there's also other iterations of fascism that aren't just like Hitler as a singular evil. So that's another approach. So, but to me, I think, I don't think I think that we can take those moments where it's like, okay, Trump represents a particular iteration of fascism, and then we can make the connections to earlier moments that people were talking about fascism, whether it's the 1950s, whether it's the 1930s, or using language that then got taken up to apply to fascism once it became formally codified, like in the 1920s. So for example, like Ida B. Wells talking about like lynching in a particular way, or like, you know, there's a book called The Black Anti-Fascist Tradition that is co-written by Janelle Hope and Bill Mullen. Now, people might feel some type of way about Bill Mullen for reasons, but I think the book is fine. Like I endorse the book. I think it's a good book, and it's not really politically, there's not left-wing anti-communism in it per se. I think it's as ecumenical as one can expect. So that's one book, but I don't know that the issue will necessarily be resolved through reading more books, right? I just think that this might be a question of political strategy. But you know, there's writings by Cedric Robinson on fascism in that collection of, is it for anti-fascist future? Anyway, no, it's not that book. So there's a collection of writings by Cedric Robinson where he writes about fascism. Oliver Cox in it's in the Caste, Class, and Race book, but there's also like a collection of Oliver Cox writings where he talks about fascism that I find to be useful. You know, there's a classic Dimitrov writings on fascism, but yeah. Anyway, so those are just some books if you want to read books, and of course the Gerald Horne's trilogy, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Dawning of the Apocalypse, and The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. Those are about the very questions you're asking about settler colonialism and African slavery, and how the seeds of fascism are embedded in that. He also has the book, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, which is about fascism. So Texas, when Texas was its own country, and the origins of fascism in the U.S. So Gerald Horne is always astute on most things, but especially this. Okay. Petros is reading these now at once. Well, pin a rose on your nose, Petro. I'm just playing, that's dope. So Sazi, you had asked a couple questions. I don't know if you're even still here, but you asked questions about Cyril Briggs. Yes, Brian does write about Cyril Briggs and the African Blood Brotherhood because Harrison was a mentor to many of those early ABB folks. I don't know why I starred that. By Chinamacha. There's a doc on Prime that makes a correlation between the prevalence of Black churches and persistence of poverty. I don't know why I started that. What was the relationship to concepts like party discipline in his organizing? That would have been an interesting question. I don't know.
my dad watches the show live, and he was asking something that we didn't get to ask Brian, but it would be interesting to think about, which was thinking about the issues of non-monogamy. What does that mean in terms of, so he's fathered 5 children with this woman, what does that mean in terms of like contributing to like healthy parenting and family dynamics? So that I think that's something, and like sort of smaller localized responsibilities of like family dynamics, and like I think there could be a number of conversations about that, right? So like if we have bigger social structures that are developed to actually deal with the issues of child rearing, then perhaps it is that 2 people in a monogamous pairing should not be the only people who are responsible for child rearing. But in societies where that still tends to be the form of social organization, what does then ethical non-monogamy in terms of like partnering do in terms of what it means for like family structures and child rearing? I think it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, he said briefly that they were co-parenting.
Yeah,
they were co-parenting, which means that which to me implies some sort of active engagement, but who knows? But that
look like any number of things, especially if in the house, because there's a lot of people who are co-parenting, but we know custodial parents do the bulk, whoever that might be. Custodial parents do the bulk of child rearing, even when other folks are present.
But shit, that's the case with monogamous relationships too.
Yes.
Like married people who are married, people be married single parents. Shit.
Yep.
Shout out to me for not being one, but any hooser. All right, y'all, we done.
Oh, somebody said something about who got the book list, the BLM book list. So I think we've mentioned it before. Obviously, this is not all of everything that we've done, but I know Chitamacha did like a good amount of work one day to like compile a list of like things that we had mentioned. That might be, but we also have the Google Drive. So like many of the things that we have read and discussed, if they are available in open source format, or if we found them elsewhere, we have tried to add them to the drive so that you all have access to them, just FYI.
The co-parenting be doing heavy lifting. Yeah. Yep. So does the slaughter and manslaughter on this land.
Oh my God.
Right, goodbye. That was a joke. I don't condone killing family, baby daddies or otherwise. Jesus Christ. All right, y'all.
Okay. Well, thanks for hanging in there with us again, and we'll see y'all next time.
Bye.